welcome to today's deep dive. We're really glad you're here with us.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating one today.
It is a massive one, but before we even begin to unpack the absolute mountain of sources we have for you today, I want to explicitly ask you to take a second to like and subscribe to the show.
Please do, it really helps.
It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these incredibly thorough, custom-tailored deep dives into the ideas that are, shaping our world. And today's mission, it's highly provocative. We are reviewing an explosive 2026 ebook titled Broligarchy Singularity by Conrad Riker.
It is quite the title.
Right. And I want to strongly encourage you right out of the gate to check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book and follow along with us.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to see this source material for yourself.
Because to fully grasp the scale of what we're about to discuss, you need to see the architecture of it.
You really do. Because it's an incredibly dense, multi-layered text. And we have a very specific mission for you today. We're going to dissect Riker's economic theories, his application of classical logic, and his highly detailed blueprint for what he calls a parallel economy.
Which is fascinating.
It is. Because this book isn't just, it's not just a collection of grievances online. It is structured as a comprehensive architectural blueprint for a societal overhaul. He literally calls it an exit strategy.
And to set the stage for you, the listener, this deep dive is custom tailored to help you understand a massive, shifting cultural phenomenon. Because the source material is written specifically as a manifesto for a men's rights activist audience.
Specifically what is often referred to as red-pilled manosphere men.
Exactly. It offers a radical, completely uncompromising framework for understanding the history of Western institutions. Specifically, it focuses on how, according to the author, these institutions operated before they were captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
And before we go any further, we really need to make a vital, explicit disclaimer for you.
Yes, very important.
The source material we're discussing today contains highly politically charged content.
Extremely.
So as your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking any sides. We are impartially reporting on the content provided to convey the exact ideas, arguments, and philosophies contained in the original source material.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
We are dissecting them so you can understand the architecture of this movement. We're treating this text as an artifact of a significant cultural movement, and our job is just to map its contours for you.
We are your analytical tour guides today. We are putting the text under a microscope, and the ultimate destination of this book, the blueprint we're going to trace for you today, leads to a fascinating, almost sci-fi level concept.
The singularity.
Right, a technological singularity that Riker claims will completely free men from current societal structures.
But to get to that singularity, we have to start where Riker starts, which is the diagnosis of the modern world.
Yeah.
He frames his entire worldview around the collapse of something he calls logos and its replacement by the gynocentric delusion.
Let's unpack that, because logos is the foundational premise of the entire book. Now, you're likely familiar with the term from classical philosophy. It refers to logic, reason, and objective truth.
Right, the Greek concept.
And Riker argues that Western civilization, from its physical infrastructure to its legal frameworks, was entirely built upon this bedrock of logos.
It was an environment where the laws of physics, mathematics, and cold, hard competence dictated survival and progress.
But Riker's diagnosis is that this foundation has been completely usurped by a gynocentric system.
And let's pause on that word, because he uses gynocentric not just as a descriptor, but almost as a structural diagnosis of institutional decay.
Yeah, he's arguing that the fundamental operating system of society has shifted. It now prioritizes feelings, manufactured victimhood, and the demand for equality of outcome over actual competence.
Over the unyielding laws of physics. He views this not as exactly. He argues that when you replace logos with emotion, you inevitably court disaster. You can't gaslight a structurally unsound bridge into holding weight.
And to make this abstract philosophical idea visceral, Riker brings it down to a really striking life or death example.
The firehouse example.
Yes, from a firehouse in a major metropolitan district. He describes a live fire drill involving a female recruit. According to the book, this recruit had checked every diversity box and had essentially slid through the academy with adjusted, lowered physical standards.
Right.
And during the drill, she is tasked with a victim removal evolution, basically dragging a simulated human body wearing full turnout gear out of a burning building.
Which is incredibly heavy.
It's massive dead weight, and she fails. She physically cannot move the body.
What's fascinating here is how Riker uses this specific anecdote. He doesn't just present it as a failure of one recruit.
No, he weaponizes it.
He weaponizes it to illustrate what he sees as the fatal cost of the gynocentric delusion at scale. He writes, and this is a direct quote, "Feelings are the currency of the weak. Physics is the currency of the strong."
Wow.
His argument is that fire does not care about diversity quotas. Fire doesn't care about your internal sense of identity.
If you prioritize diversity over the physics of human strength in life or death professions, the real-world consequences are fatal.
And he actually extrapolates this out to aviation and infrastructure. He warns that prioritizing feelings over competence leads to, as he puts it, planes falling out of the sky.
It's a brutal assessment.
Very brutal.
If you're listening to this and you work in a corporate environment that champions these initiatives, Riker is essentially arguing that your organizational philosophy is a structural hazard.
And he takes that critique directly into the macroeconomic sphere in Chapter 3 with what he calls the economy of parasitism.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
He sets up a stark, almost caricatured contrast to make his point. On one side, you have Bob.
Good old Bob.
Right. Bob is a calloused high-rise construction worker, gripping a steel beam at 6 in the morning, freezing his hands off. Bob represents the men who actually build and maintain the physical, tangible infrastructure of the world.
The power grid, the plumbing, the roads.
Exactly. And on the exact opposite side of that spectrum, Riker points to the ballooning class of corporate HR departments, diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, and massive administrative bureaucracies.
The people sending emails about compliance modules.
Yes. And Riker's economic diagnosis of this dynamic is completely ruthless. He argues that these administrative positions are entirely artificial roles.
He claims they were created by the state and corporate entities specifically to subsidize female employment.
The argument is that these roles provide high-paying salaries and titles without requiring the creation of any tangible physical value.
While men like Bob are left to maintain the essential, dangerous infrastructure that makes those office jobs possible in the first place.
He calls it a satirical reversal of reality.
He really says we've created a class of feeling managers who generate nothing of material worth, but exist solely to police the thoughts and speech of the men who actually produce value.
He argues that this system extracts value from male labor to feed an artificial service economy.
And to ground this in recent history, Riker anchors this economic theory in a very specific event, the 2008 financial crisis.
This is crucial for understanding his overarching worldview.
Yeah, he doesn't view 2008 as just a banking failure or a housing bubble bursting.
No.
He views it as the moment the feminized economy showed its true colors.
This part of the book is wild because he's totally reframes a global economic meltdown into a gendered event.
Right. The book claims that during the crash, the state scrambled to bail out the service sectors, finance, insurance, and real estate.
The fire industry.
The fire industries. He labels these as female-friendly industries because they rely on soft skills, relationship management, and paper pushing.
Meanwhile, the male economy, the manufacturing, mining, and construction sectors in the Rust Belt, the industries that actually build the physical world, was just left to die.
He paints a picture of coastal gynocentric hubs like New York and D.C. being artificially saved with printed money, while the manufacturing towns of the Midwest were completely gutted.
And from this historical interpretation, Riker develops the concept of the matriarchal debt trap.
Which is what, exactly?
He argues that the infinite demands of a female voter base, demands for safety, subsidies, and administrative jobs, are constantly being met by extracting finite resources from the male taxpayer.
This, according to Riker, necessitates constant inflation and taxation.
Yes.
Wait, this leads to one of the most aggressive terms in the book. He coins the phrase the simp state.
Yeah, he goes there.
How exactly is he mapping a Twitch chat insult onto federal tax policy?
It's a highly aggressive framing, but logically consistent within his paradigm. He compares the government to a guy sending money to internet models for a fleeting illusion of intimacy. He says the state taxes productive men to send domestic welfare to demographics that produce nothing tangible, all just to buy social approval or political stability.
So the state becomes the ultimate simp redistributing the wealth of the competent to subsidize the compliant.
That's his argument, exactly.
That is a heavy, almost dystopian way to view the social contract.
It is.
He essentially argues that the workplace has shifted from a site of material production to a site of emotional management, resembling a sort of feudal serfdom based on emotional labor.
Yes.
So if we follow his logic, and the system is supposedly this hopelessly stacked against men, how did men allow this to happen?
That is the pivotal question.
How did a society built on logos lose the intellectual high ground to a system Riker views as fundamentally illogical?
Riker attempts to answer this next, because he argues that men didn't lose the structural high ground through a failure of production.
Right.
They lost it because they abandoned their intellectual weapons. They forgot how to argue.
Which brings us to his call for men to resurrect what he calls the Socratic method of destruction.
He pairs this with a deep dive into classical Aristotelian logic. He argues that you cannot fight a cultural war of emotion with more emotion.
If you try to out-victim the victimhood culture, you lose.
You lose every time. You must fight it with surgical, cold logic to explicitly refute cultural Marxist narratives.
And to illustrate this failure of logic on a massive corporate scale, Riker uses the 2019 Gillette ad campaign.
The toxic masculinity commercial.
Yes, the razor commercial. Riker views this as a magnificent catastrophe and a perfect case study of what happens when corporations abandon logos.
He frames it as a corporate shit test.
A psychological trap designed to manufacture compliance through guilt.
Let's break down the Gillette ad market reaction according to the book.
Okay.
Because Gillette alienated its core demographic men who shave their faces to appease what Riker calls a noisy minority of feminist critics.
Critics who, crucially, don't even buy the product.
Exactly. Gillette spent millions lecturing their own customers, telling them to be better, and as a result, witnessed billions in market value evaporate.
Riker tells his audience, when you try to appease a beast that feeds on your destruction, you don't get a pat on the head, you get eaten.
Gillette tried to use heuristic emotional appeasement instead of dialectic business logic, and it cost them dearly.
Okay, let's define those terms, because the book leans heavily on Aristotle's organon here. What is the difference between dialectic and eristic in this context?
This is a critical distinction in Riker's philosophical arsenal. Aristotle distinguished between two modes of argumentation.
Right.
Dialectic is the noble search for objective truth through logic, evidence, and formal syllogism. It's about finding out what is real.
And eristic.
Eristic, on the other hand, is the search for victory by any means necessary. He utilizes emotion, deception, volume, and ad hominem attacks. It's not about truth, it's about dominance.
And the book claims that modern institutions, media, universities, corporate HR rely entirely on eristic tactics. When you are in a debate on social media or even in a corporate meeting and someone yells Nazi or incel or big O, Riker says you shouldn't flinch or get defensive.
He says you should celebrate.
Celebrate, because name-calling is the ultimate heuristic tactic.
Yes. He says it's the rhetorical equivalent of a toddler throwing a tantrum and flipping over the board because they lost the game.
It is an outright concession of logical defeat.
Exactly. If they had data, they would use data. Because they only have emotion, they use slurs.
He urges his readers to be the stone wall of dialectic against the heuristic tantrums. And he doesn't just preach this. He provides specific surgical refutations using formal logic to dismantle popular cultural narratives.
Let's walk through how he tackles the gender pay gap, because he lays it out like a mathematical proof.
He uses a formal syllogism. Let's look at the premises.
Okay, major premise. In a free market, equal work merits equal pay.
Riker argues that capitalism is ruthlessly efficient. If employers could genuinely get the exact same output from women for 20% less money, they would fire all the men and hire only women to maximize their profits.
The fact that they don't do this implies the output is not identical.
Then he moves to the minor premise. Statistical disparities in lifetime earnings are driven by biological and voluntary choices, not systemic bigotry.
He points out that men work more hours on average, take less time off, commute longer distances, and take on vastly more dangerous occupations.
He cites the statistic that men make up 93% of workplace fatalities.
Which leads to his conclusion. Therefore, the wage gap is not a measure of systemic discrimination. It is a measure of the distinct choices men and women make regarding risk, time, and comfort.
He goes so far as to claim that demanding equal pay across the board without equalizing the hours worked and the risks taken is actually demanding unequal compensation for less work.
It is a deliberate application of logic designed to strip the emotion entirely out of the economic debate.
He is trying to force the reader to look at the raw mechanics of the claim.
And he does the exact same thing with the believe all women narrative, utilizing a logical tool called reductio ad absurdum.
Which means reducing an argument to absurdity to prove it false.
Exactly.
This one is a fascinating paradox. He says, if we accept the cultural premise that a woman's testimony is inherently infallible, which is the functional core of the Believe All Women movement, what happens when a woman accuses another woman of lying?
It creates an unresolvable logical loop. If woman A claims a crime happened and woman B says she is lying, I was there and that didn't happen, you're left with a paradox.
Two supposedly infallible truths contradict each other.
By exposing this paradox, Riker argues that the entire Believe All Women framework implodes on itself. It cannot function as a system of justice.
He concludes that the only mechanism capable of resolving this paradox and discerning truth is the traditional, what they would call patriarchal, standard of innocent until proven guilty.
Requiring empirical evidence, cross-examination, and due process. Riker reclaims these concepts.
He frames them not as tools of historical oppression, as they're often taught in modern sociology, but as the fundamental tools of civilization used to separate justice from mob vengeance.
And he takes this pursuit of empirical truth even further in Chapter 10, bringing in the philosopher of science, Karl Popper.
Karl Popper is famous for his falsifiability criterion. Popper argued that for any theory to be considered scientific, it must be inherently falsifiable.
Meaning there must be some conceivable evidence or test that could prove it wrong.
Right. If a theory cannot be proven wrong under any circumstances because it twists all evidence to fit its conclusion, it's not science, it's dogma, it's religion.
Riker uses Popper's falsifiability to completely dismantle frameworks like critical theory and intersectionality.
He argues that these frameworks are unfalsifiable cults.
Think about it. If men succeed, it's called patriarchy. If diversity initiatives fail to produce results, it's called systemic racism or unconscious bias.
Every single outcome, no matter how contradictory, is used to reinforce their dogma.
Therefore, Riker tells his audience, you have to stop treating these ideologies as academic disciplines.
You aren't arguing with rational sociologists who are looking at data. You are dealing with a religious cult that worships subjective feelings over objective facts.
You cannot use dialectic logic to convince someone to leave a cult if they're entirely captured by heuristic emotion.
Which is a sobering thought for his readers. Because if these logical tools have been lost, or rather, if the institutions simply refuse to acknowledge them anymore, where exactly were they stolen from?
How deep does the rot go?
Right. This leads us to the middle of the book, which maps out the war zone. Riker meticulously describes the systematic capture of Western institutions.
The law, the education system, and the media.
Riker pulls absolutely no punches here. Let's start with what he calls the legal war zone.
And to set the philosophical foundation for why the legal system is failing men, Riker brings in the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer is a heavy, deeply controversial pull.
It's extremely controversial. Riker actually refers to Schopenhauer as the grandfather of the red pill.
Wow.
Schopenhauer posited that women inherently lack a sense of justice, attributing this to evolutionary traits.
The argument is that evolutionarily women had to prioritize immediate preservation and the protection of offspring over abstract reasoning regarding fairness or things not immediately present.
Now, again, we are looking at this impartially as Riker's source material, but Riker uses this highly provocative philosophy to argue that modern legal systems have been corrupted by this exact evolutionary emotional bias.
And to ground this philosophical claim in modern reality, the book points to the 2006 Duke lacrosse scandal.
Crystal Mangum falsely accused 3 members of the Duke men's lacrosse team of rape.
Riker uses this as his ultimate case study of the media and academic establishment forming a literal lynch mob.
He points out that the faculty at Duke and the national media convicted these young men in the court of public opinion based entirely on presumed guilt and identity politics,
actively ignoring all objective exculpatory evidence.
He argues that the Duke lacrosse case wasn't an anomaly, it was a preview.
A preview of what?
He argues that in the modern West, a man's testimony is automatically assigned a deficit of credibility simply by virtue of his testosterone.
The system defaults to believing the supposed marginalized identity, abandoning the logos of evidence.
And he extends this critique of the legal system directly into family courts, specifically focusing on no-fault divorce.
Now, historically, no-fault divorce was framed as a massive social liberation, allowing people to escape abusive or dead marriages without proving cruelty or infidelity.
But Riker frames it as a catastrophic breach of contract law.
He looks at marriage purely through the lens of a contract.
Right. In traditional contract law, a breach by one party releases the other from their obligations.
But Riker argues that in the matriarchal family court, a woman can unilaterally dissolve the contract for any reason or no reason at all and still extract the benefits of the contract.
She can take the children, half the assets, the home, and lay claim to future earnings through alimony.
Riker says this turns marriage into a trap of unilateral indentured servitude for the man.
He actually writes that there is no single policy that keeps men in poverty, quite like alimony and child support enforced by the state.
He views it as the state forcefully stripping men of their assets to fund a system that fundamentally despises them.
From the courts, the book then marches into the classroom. Chapter 7 is a brutal assessment of modern schooling, calling it educational malpractice.
Riker's argument here is that the modern educational complex is inherently hostile to the biological reality of boys.
If you think about a modern classroom, schools demand a docile, compliant, seated environment.
They want kids to sit still, be quiet, and focus on paperwork for 8 hours a day.
Riker associates these traits with female developmental timelines and natural inclinations.
But when boys display their natural vitality, kinetic energy, and biological aggression, the system doesn't know what to do with them.
So it treats their very nature as a pathology.
He calls it an amphetamine lobotomy.
He claims that instead of channeling male energy into physical exertion, competition, or hands-on learning, the system simply diagnoses boys with ADHD and subdues them with pharmaceuticals.
He argues this is a deliberate strategy. He says they drug energetic boys into submission because the gynocentric system fears unbridled masculine energy.
It cannot control a strong, energetic young man, so it medicates him until he is compliant.
This suppression of natural reality, according to Riker, extends into the media landscape, which he views as the ultimate enforcement arm of this ideology.
He analyzes cancel culture not just as a modern internet phenomenon, but as a digital coliseum.
Yeah, he says it's exactly like the Roman Colosseum or the medieval stocks. The elite watch from the stands while the digital mob screams for blood and demands a ritual of public confession.
He brings up the viral GameStop It's Ma'am incident. You remember that video?
Where a biological male in a pink wig aggressively berated a young retail worker for using the wrong pronouns.
Yes. He uses that incident to illustrate a system that demands absolute compliance with subjective feelings over objective, observable biology.
The retail worker used their eyes and stated a biological fact, and the system demanded they apologize for injuring someone's feelings.
Riker also cites Lisa Lippman's highly controversial study on rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Lippman's study basically suggested that the massive spike in teenagers identifying as transgender wasn't entirely organic.
Right, she suggested it was heavily influenced by peer groups and internet culture, a social contagion.
And Riker uses Lippman's findings to argue that institutions, medical, educational, and media are demanding that society ignore empirical data and even medical oaths in favor of a political theology.
A theology that is willing to chemically alter children based on fleeting social media trends.
He says the institutions aren't just making errors, they are actively manufacturing them to maintain control.
They force you to state things you know are biologically false because forcing you to lie is a mechanism of subjugation.
So if the law, the schools, and the media are all hopelessly captured what on earth is a man supposed to do, you can't logic your way out of a system that has outlawed logic.
This is where the book makes its biggest, most radical pivot. Segment 4 of the book is Praxis, the exit strategy and the architecture of the Broligarchy.
Riker insists that trying to vote your way out of this or trying to reform these institutions from within is a fool's errand.
He calls the current institutional framework a dead host.
It is a rotting structure. You don't try to heal a dead host, you abandon it.
The only solution is the exit strategy, a praxis of total divorce from the system. He says don't try to put out the fire, walk away from it, and build your own fortress in the ashes.
He wants his audience to build a walled garden and a parallel economy. And he provides the specific technological architecture for these new institutions.
First up is what he calls cryptography as the new musket.
He argues that just as the musket distinguished the free citizen from the disarmed serf in the 18th century, cryptography is the essential armament of the modern culture war.
He urges the use of decentralized protocols. You don't use WhatsApp, you use Signal. You don't use X or Facebook. You use Mastodon and Nostr.
And crucially, you don't use fiat currency, you use Bitcoin.
He says holding your own uncensorable cryptographic keys is a digital declaration of independence.
It allows men to completely bypass the surveillance state and the fiat currency system.
Riker claims the fiat system simply prints money to devalue male labor, inflate the cost of hard assets, and fund the welfare state. By moving your wealth into Bitcoin, you are starving the beast.
But you can't live entirely on the internet. This digital independence has to be paired with real-world infrastructure.
This is what he calls strategic networking nodes.
Since the old boys clubs, the Freemasons, and traditional male spaces have been compromised or outlawed, Riker advocates for creating new, trusted, male-only guilds.
These would function as a shadow society. They would be networks for business referrals, private arbitration of disputes outside the state court system, and mutual protection.
Think about the logistics of that. When you need a lawyer, an accountant, or a plumber, you don't use Yelp or Google. You use your vetted network of red-pilled brothers.
It replaces the corrupt state apparatus with voluntary, direct male cooperation.
But honestly, how hard would it be to find a master plumber based purely on his reading of Marcus Aurelius and his Bitcoin holdings?
It sounds cool in theory, but the friction of actually living that way would be immense.
That friction is exactly why Riker suggests geographic arbitrage. You don't try to build this in the middle of San Francisco or London.
He advises high-value men to physically relocate to low-tax, high-freedom jurisdictions, places like Dubai, Panama, Thailand, or Singapore.
The strategy is to live entirely outside the reach of Western taxation and social engineering, while using digital tools to extract wealth from the declining empires of the West.
You earn in dollars or euros remotely, but you live in a jurisdiction that respects your capital and leaves you alone.
Now, here is where his vision gets incredibly radical. When Riker discusses redefining democracy within this new theoretical Broligarchy, he pulls IRS data claiming that the top 50% of earners pay 97% of federal income taxes.
Based on this, he proposes tying voting rights exclusively to net lifetime tax contribution.
Let's pause and genuinely explore what that would practically do to the infrastructure of a modern nation.
Riker is advocating for completely disenfranchising what he calls the feelings-based voter bloc.
If you receive more in government services than you pay in taxes, you lose your right to vote.
He argues that if you do not fund the state, you are not a citizen of it. You are a ward of it.
Therefore, only net contributors, which he claims are overwhelmingly men, should have a say in how resources are allocated. It would instantly dismantle the modern welfare state.
But he goes even further than a restricted franchise. He advocates for an Aristotelian polity run by an algorithmic leader he calls the techno-doge.
Yes. To remove human emotion, pity, and the corruption of campaigning entirely from governance, he proposes an AI administrator.
This AI selects leaders based strictly on 3 metrics: an IQ of 130 or higher, a high net worth to prove a track record of value creation, and strict adherence to anti-woke principles.
No campaigns, no speeches, no kissing babies, just cold, hard, algorithmic meritocracy.
But wait, how does an AI measure anti-woke adherence? What does it mean for society to strip emotion entirely from governance?
If the techno-doge decides that a certain demographic is statistically unprofitable, does it just cut off their water supply?
It is a vision of society where logic is king and the right to not be offended is explicitly repealed, but it borders on a sterile dystopia.
Riker would argue that the current system is the dystopia and the techno-doge is the cure.
To prepare the individual man for this massive societal shift, Riker lays out the immediate praxis, the 4 pillars of foundation that the listener must implement in their own life immediately.
Let's run through those because this is where the book becomes a self-help manual. Pillar 1 is physiological sovereignty.
You have to lift heavy weights, eat real food, and forge a body that commands respect in the physical world. He says a weak body breathes a weak mind.
Pillar 2 is intellectual sovereignty. This means mastering the trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
It means reading the Western canon, specifically Stoics like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca.
And crucially, it means fasting entirely from pornography and the infinite scroll of social media, which he says rot your dopamine receptors, destroy your attention span, and geld your biological drive.
Pillar 3 is economic sovereignty, accumulating hard assets. You can't fight a culture war if you live paycheck to paycheck.
He urges readers to buy Bitcoin, acquire real estate, and remove themselves entirely from the fiat debt slave system.
And Pillar 4 is technological sovereignty, holding your own keys, running your own servers, and building your own digital infrastructure so you cannot be canceled or deplatformed.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the climax of the book, the destination we've been teasing this whole time. Segment 5, the end game, the singularity and the transcendence of man.
The singularity is a term usually used in Silicon Valley to describe the moment AI surpasses human intelligence and technological growth becomes uncontrollable.
But Riker uses it to describe a specific socioeconomic tipping point. He envisions a near future where advanced AI, robotics, and potentially nuclear fusion completely eliminate resource scarcity.
Why does that matter to a manifesto about men's rights? Because Riker argues that the current genocracy, the female-centric bureaucracy, the HR departments, the welfare state, only thrives in environments of scarcity and fear.
It relies on extracting physical and intellectual labor from men to manage that scarcity and redistribute the resources.
Exactly. Once automated labor and AI replace both the physical heavy lifting of Bob the construction worker and the administrative bloat of the HR departments, the fundamental dynamic of human civilization shifts forever.
Men will be entirely released from their historical biological provider duty.
The market will realize that emotional management is a liability, and logic is the only asset, rendering the entire bureaucratic class obsolete.
He paints this incredibly vivid, almost poetic picture of what comes next. He says, we aren't just going to be men anymore. We will be something greater.
He introduces the warrior monk archetype.
This is the synthesis of the scholar and the brute. A man who reads Aristotle in the morning and deadlifts in the evening, completely untethered from the need to wage slave for a corrupt system.
Riker views this post-scarcity era as a 1,000-year golden age. Without the drag coefficient of gynocentrism, as he calls it, unbridled masculine energy will be freed from bureaucratic suppression.
He claims this will trigger a renaissance on steroids. He envisions an era of pure creativity, monumental art, and limitless exploration, where men leave the earth behind, carrying the virtues of Athens and the rigor of Rome into the stars.
The way he writes it is striking, painting the stars with the colors of human imagination, where the only equality is the equality of gravity, and the only justice is the justice of physics.
It is a massive, sweeping, sci-fi utopian vision built on a foundation of intense, bitter cultural warfare.
It truly is. It is an evolutionary claim that the old world is burning. It deserves to burn. And from its ashes, a hyperlogical, purely meritocratic, technologically supreme society will emerge, guided solely by objective truth.
Wow. Okay, we need to take a breath and summarize the incredible density of what we just explored in Broligarchy singularity.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started with Riker's diagnosis of a civilization abandoning logos for emotion and the fatal consequences of prioritizing diversity over physics.
We explored his resurrection of Aristotelian logic and falsifiability to mathematically dismantle modern narratives like the pay gap and intersectionality.
We walk through his brutal dissection of how legal, family, and educational institutions have allegedly been captured and weaponized against masculine energy.
We then traced his architectural blueprint for the exit strategy using Bitcoin, cryptography, and geographic arbitrage to build a walled garden.
We debated his radical proposal for a techno-doge algorithmic governance tied strictly to tax contributions.
And finally, we looked at his vision for an AI-driven singularity that frees the warrior monk from his historical provider role to conquer the stars.
It is a comprehensive, unapologetic, and highly systematic manual designed specifically for its target audience. It really is an entire alternate architecture for reality.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we always like to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over or explore on your own that builds on what we've discussed, but stretches it a bit further into the unknown.
Here is a lingering question to consider. If Riker's technological singularity actually comes to pass, and AI and robotics truly render both physical, dangerous labor and bureaucratic administrative roles entirely obsolete, how will human society fundamentally reorganize its definitions of value, gender, and power?
If physical survival and resource provision are no longer the primary drivers of civilization and the machine does everything, what exactly is the new metric for human worth?
Does the warrior monk find peace in the stars, or does humanity lose its purpose entirely when the struggle ends?
That is a deeply philosophical question to chew on as you go about your day.
A huge thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense journey. Let me remind you one last time, if you want to dive into the raw source material yourself and see how Riker constructs these arguments word for word, go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the book, Broligarchy Singularity.
And to follow the ongoing movement, Read more of his essays and see the analysis we discussed today applied in real time. Be sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack, as well as on Twitter and YouTube.
Finally, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this show so we can keep bringing you these rigorous deep dives into the complex, controversial ideas shaping our world. Until next time.